So, Nadja, I'd like to start with you first. Your book, Period Power. Why did you want to write this book?
Well, for me, I sort of recognize that this menstrual movement is no longer just me and a few friends gathering on weekends, putting together period packages and giving them to shelters. I think it was really taking a step back last year, actually, and realizing that we're a full-blown movement for social and systemic change, realizing that even in this movement that we had started just in our own rooms, had become this network of over 400 campus chapters in all 50 states, mobilizing on the ground, passing policy every week, and fighting to destigmatize something that's been stigmatized since the beginning of humankind. And for me, I think I was 20 at the time. I sort of was thinking about like, actually in one of my classes, I was like reading these, texts of feminism and reading like the Riot Girl Manifesto, Red Stockings Manifesto of the 1960s women's movement, realizing that there are these books that sort of set the agenda for and called attention to the fact that the women's movement was real and urgent. And I looked around and realized that we didn't have that for fourth wave feminism, and decided that I wanted to write it. So I Googled how to write a book, and it just got published by Simon & Schuster. Yeah, but thank you. So it really came from that place of being like, I want to tell the world that the menstrual movement is here, it is urgent, and something that young people are well positioned to make a difference in. And noticing in my peer community around me that there wasn't this unified agenda. And I felt periods were sort of a funny and great way to start, and so wrote this book, Period Power, a manifesto for the menstrual movement.
Thank you. And Christina, you have a book as well, Cinder Girl. What motivated you to write that book?
So when I was homeless, because I aged out of foster care at 18, I wrote down in my journal that I was going to write my story to change the way that foster youth were being treated. And so I started writing little stories of how my siblings and I grew up. And I knew at 18 that that's what I wanted to do. And it took me 12 years to find a literary agent, to get a publisher. HarperCollins picked me up, and now I'm on a national book tour. But it's a little bit different. It took me 12 years, took you a year, but, But long story short, I mean, I think it just goes to show you that you can't quit. And because of the drive I had to really reform foster care, even after rejection letter, I just was not going to give up on sharing my story, because one voice can change a life. And if you can change a life, you can change a community. And if you can change a community, you can change a nation. And so I just think I just never wanted to give up on Cinder Girl.
Thank you for not giving up. Sure, go ahead and applaud it. What I'm hearing from both of you is there is this common theme of empowerment, right? Taking an unjust social issue that you really care about and turning it its head to real civic change, and for you guys, real answers. Why? What do you think about that? Empowerment.
I mean, I never dreamed of being a period activist when I grew up. Like, for me, I truly mean it, that like activism is what saved my life when I really needed it, and it has been just this addicting empowerment for me. I started my organization when I was 16, and my passion for periods comes from a really personal place. My family also, similar to your story, very different. We found ourselves living without a home of our own when I was 16. And during that time, my commute to school turned to about 2 hours long each way on public transportation. And regularly on that journey, I would hear these stories from other homeless women who were in much worse living situations than I was in. I started asking them, like, what's the most challenging thing about your living situation? And that's where I heard these stories of using toilet paper and socks and brown paper grocery bags and cardboard to take care of their periods. And it was this privilege check for me in realizing, even in this time when my family was facing this adversity, like how privileged I was never to have thought about what it would be like to not have access to period products. And I think for me at the time, at the age of 16, I was coming to the realization that I grew up with child and sex abuse in my own family. I found myself in a really abusive relationship where rape and sexual assault were sort of this daily part of my life that I accepted because I think there was part of me that felt like I deserved it, part of me that thought it felt super familiar, but also part of me that was genuinely confused about how my self-worth could come from something beyond my body. And when I started hearing about periods and these stories about period poverty, it lit this fire in me of like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, that was really my reaction. Like, I remember Googling and learned that at the time in 2014, 40 states in the US had a sales tax on period products, considering them luxury items. Meanwhile, products like Rogaine and Viagra nationally are considered essential goods and don't have that tax. And when I learned about that and I started talking to people, and I would realize, especially for the older white gentlemen in my life, like, that I would come to them and be like, let me talk to you about this thing about periods and what I'm learning about, and they would literally make this disgusted face, right? And I noticed that within a few minutes of telling them about what I was learning, I could convince them to be a period warrior with me. And that realization, realizing that I had power just in talking about this issue, made me realize that my self-worth came from much more than my body, but came from my voice and my potential and my passion. And that was so addicting that it's what gave me the courage to get out of a lot of the situations I was in, that gave me the motivation to do what I do now. And how I think of leadership truly is I can only be a leader if I'm empowering others to be leaders themselves. And so activism for me has saved my life and empowered me to be a leader. And what my mission is just to give other young people especially the platform to be activists and leaders themselves.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
I think for me, I grew up in such horrific suffering with my siblings that I didn't want other children in the United States to go through that same suffering. And so when I wrote out my 20-year plan in my two-door Chevy Cavalier, which was, the book was on there as well, I decided that I was going to reform foster care. And how did that journey start? Well, it started with the desire to not allow others to suffer. So I think suffering, I utilized that as a tool to push myself into a place where I could help others. And now, 12 years in, I continue to tap into that PTSD that I was diagnosed with at 11. So others don't have to, so foster care children don't have to endure what I endured, but they can have the same opportunities that their peers have. So they can have the same chance at life in the American dream. So they can break the cycle of poverty and abuse. So 80% of the prison system doesn't have to be former foster youth. And so I think for me, really being engaged and really pushing into the mission and accomplishing it comes from a place of brokenheartedness, but also a place of this beautiful democracy that we live in, to where no matter where you come from, homeless, poverty, nothing, started from the negative, that you can rise above and you become a leader. And so I do serve the United States Army. I'm very privileged to do that. Thank you. Thank you. And so for me, I'm a servant leader in and out of uniform. It's my duty to serve my country in uniform, and it's also my duty to serve my country out of uniform. And how do I do that? Well, I push for foster care reform. I push for advocacy for mental health, specifically trauma therapy, and I encourage others to engage in issues in our nation. Foster care is a crisis. It's a national crisis. And so I think for me, the passion and the drive come from just knowing that change is possible, and if we tap into it together, then we can accomplish the mission.
You can accomplish the mission. Let's talk for a second about education. You both have created these incredible orgs that are all about listening and responding to need or a problem through education. I've heard countless stories from women about not being heard by doctors and not being heard about what their bodies are going through. And children of the foster system living with abuse and poor conditions because they don't know a way out. Mm-hmm. There's no education. Mm-hmm. So why is education so vital to the work that you both do?
So in the area that I work in, I think it's absolutely critical that foster youth are educated on the opportunities and the organizations that can help them break the cycle of poverty and abuse. It's absolutely essential that they are educated, that they can be successful and as equal as their peers. And how do we do that? Well, we have to do it on a community level. We have to have community members engage and say, hey, you have this opportunity to stay in foster care until you're 21. It's called Foster to 21. Most states are now picking that up. Most states offer free tuition for college for foster youth. Why is only 2% of foster youth in our nation graduating college? It's absurd when there's free tuition. I think the critical need for our kids to be educated and the opportunities that they have will help break that cycle of poverty and abuse. I think the other twofold of that is having the community be aware so they know how we can break the cycle of poverty and abuse, which also affects the community as a whole, right? So I think education is critical so people know the opportunities that are there to bring healing, to bring wholeness, so our children can grow up and have healthy, whole relationships, which is the goal. And I also think that being aware, like awareness is kind of coexisting with education, and I think that's just a critical part so people can break the cycle.
I think, oh, sorry.
Thank you.
What you're referring to, this phenomenon where women's symptoms and feelings are being dismissed and minimized, is what we, sort of in the menstrual movement, as we call it, that's what we call the trust gap, right? This idea that so often women are going to their doctors talking about their period pain or their hormonal changes, and it's being dismissed as period cramps or just PMS, right? But in the reality, there are so many conditions that are related to periods that cause so much pain or discomfort. One of the most common ones being endometriosis. So endometriosis is a condition that 10% of women, and actually probably more than that, have in the US. But the majority of women who have it don't know that they have it because it's really hard to diagnose. And the symptoms are basically extreme versions of cramps, right? But because of the period stigma, we barely learn to talk about our own periods, right? Let alone like talk to other people about our periods. And for medical professionals, for them, they don't really know how to ask the right questions about periods too. So much of our work, especially with underrepresented communities, is not only telling them about what questions to ask and telling them about the different conditions to inquire about, but also working with medical health professionals to tell them what endometriosis is. And I'm always surprised by how many doctors I meet who have not heard about them or not ever met a case of uterine fibroids. So it's something that we're really working on within the health industry. At the same time, I would say education and raising awareness is the link to making systemic change. In complete honesty, I don't think that nonprofits and what I'm doing right now as a nonprofit leader is making long-term change. Because I realize that at the end of the day, if my organization disappeared and our direct services stopped, in 10, 20 years from now, those same people probably won't have access to period products, right? For me, I do think that the long-term goal of making systemic change is to change the system itself through policy. But I realize that in order to do that, we have to pass legislation that gets period products in schools, in shelters, in prisons, repeals the tampon tax, gets things like the food stamps to cover period products as necessity, which they currently don't. But I've met so many people who work in policy and legislators, and it becomes apparent to me that we cannot change and pass that policy until we change culture, until we get those legislators even comfortable to say periods or tampons on the House floor, right? Until we can get constituents to know that when they see a tax code about period products, they know what that means, right? So for us, my end goal is not about periods. My end goal is about gender equality, and I just know that we have to address periods to get to gender equality. And in order to do that, we need to pass this policy, and the link to get there is education and raising awareness.
Yeah, very well put. And as a parent too, and parents too, fathers and mothers, when you talk to your daughters, it shouldn't be in hushed tones with shame. It's like a beautiful, natural thing. It actually is it's great news, but it's like this bad thing's gonna happen and you have to do this, and I've never really understood that. We had a red party for my daughter when she was 14. And we celebrated with all the girls in her school.
But I think it's even acknowledging that it's a big deal for you to come out and say like period, because I mean, for so long, I mean, everyone has these euphemisms for periods, right? Like I was getting my makeup done with them earlier, and she said, I call it Shark Week, right? But like Shark Week, Strawberry Week, the rag, time of the month, we all know these euphemisms, and we all have these like shared experiences of like, raise your hand if you have the experience of putting a tampon up your sleeve, right? Right? But like the fact that without saying it, we have these shared experiences because society and the stigma conditions us to know to hide it, to have these nicknames for it when we don't want to say the word period, and to hide the period products when we go to the bathroom, and that's what we're trying to end.
Yes, thank you. We are running out of time. I could talk about periods forever, apparently. Let's all say period together. 1, 2, 3. Period! Period! It's lovely. What would you say to those listening, just a real quick remark about how they can get involved in your particular orgs, in your particular fights?
So I think it goes back to intention and time. So you have to have a plan. I'm a planner. I planned my 25-year plan when I was almost at 18. I am currently in year 12, 13-ish. And so I think you have to have a plan. If you're passionate about a certain issue, let's say it is foster care like me, you need to get on the Google, or you need to get into organizations in your community that tackle that issue. If you're curious about something and you want to get involved, then do your due diligence and get involved. It's called action. It's called getting messy and getting your hands dirty. People don't like to do it. It takes a lot of work. It takes effort. But I think the first step is just doing it. So figure out your plan of action, get your task list in, right? Get your tasks written down, and then till the soil, and the harvest will come.
I was just going to say, I think I'm on the opposite spectrum of that because I never really have a plan. And I think, if anything, I've just learned that you just have to go for it, right? Like, when I wanted to do something about periods, I decided I wanted to start a nonprofit, and I didn't know what the fuck that meant. I just knew that adults in my life use the word nonprofit to signify like doing something good for your community. And so I Googled what is a nonprofit and what is the IRS. And without a plan, I was just like, let's take action. Let me look at my friends and be like, we don't have a plan. We don't have a nonprofit degree, but we're going to go for it. And that same mentality is what carried me to do that. It carried me to run for office when I was 19. I ran for city council and became the youngest Asian American to run for office in the US. But when I was running for office, I Googled, thank you. But when I was running for office, I Googled, what does it take to run for office? Realized that you had to be 18, and I felt overqualified because I was 19, and we did it, right? But I think that that's the mentality of like, we live in this world where we're always asking young people, what do you want to be when you grow up, right? The reality is, we don't know. We're still living life, we're still figuring out what we want. So I think the question should be, what do you want to be now? And if that question, the answer to that question happens to be something in the menstrual movement, you can find out more about Period at period.org. Or connect with me on social media at Nadia Okamoto or at Period Movement. And we have so many ways to get involved, from hosting a packing party, to starting a chapter, to signing a petition. We want you wherever we can get you in this period fight. Yeah.
Wow, amazing. You are both so incredibly brave and inspiring, and I hope when I grow up and figure out what I want to do, I am with you. You can find out more about their journeys and their 2 books, Period Power and Cinder Girl. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just honored to be on the stage with you.